Welcome to Health Creators, where we discuss new creations in healthcare and building the future of health innovation. This is Liv. I'm a health tech founder in the clinical trial space, and I'm joined here today by Alannah Chauhan, Director of Business Development at Medable, where she brings decentralized clinical trials to pharma globally. How far away are we from a system that actually changes things, right?
I think the hardest thing within this industry is that pharma is so risk adverse. Like you hear it all the time. When COVID came, suddenly they had to use technology, so everyone bounced on it and they were loving it. And now COVID's died down again, and I feel like pharma's almost just bouncing right back to what it was used to before, going back to paper ways of doing things instead of utilising technology. Do you think
so?
Yeah.
Like post-COVID, they were like, that's great. It's kind of like remote work, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, we love remote work because we have to.
Yeah.
And then now that COVID's over, they're like, okay, yeah, exactly. Do you kind of see that where it's like, hey, we adopted all of this technology because patients literally could not come to hospitals, right?
Yeah.
And now that they can, they're like, okay,
yeah, exactly. Now they're kind of like, oh, but the paper that we were using before to consent the patients, that worked fine. So we're just going to go back to it. And it's kind of like, ugh, but we were doing so well. Like, it feels like that 2 years just wasn't quite enough time to solidify farmers' belief and trust in technology, because they're just so used to doing what they've always known. So that's the conversations I have day to day are about, but paper's working fine for us. Why should we use technology?
Really?
Yeah.
Still,
especially within Europe. So I look after majority of Europe, APAC, and the Middle East in terms of my client base. So in the US, they're very technology driven. Pharma in the US, they're a lot more willing to sort of to adopt technology, but in Europe there's regulatory concerns. Each regulatory body has different advice, so different areas have different regulations, and then that adds another level of complexity where confusion occurs, where some people think, oh, you can't use that in France, when you can in a certain way. So it adds a whole other layer of complexity that the regulatory bodies in each country are not aligned. Yeah. They all have different ways of doing things.
So do you have like a cheat code?
Yeah, you kind of can't even have a cheat code, especially when I look after APAC as well. APAC's another ball game. Like, you start looking at China and the way that they are only data can't leave the soil. The data has to stay there.
So your servers have to be Chinese servers, basically.
Basically, and you also have to have staff on the ground if there's any issues. So that's again very different. So there's so many different things that people are like, oh, is it worth the hassle?
Well, you staff on the ground. So in order for, a site in China to adopt Medable would have to hire someone to actually go to the site, or
to be there just in case.
Really?
Yeah, it's very it's interesting. It's not just Medable. It's every sort of technology
provider.
And
it's interesting.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the issues come, and they're also culturally. I mean, decentralized clinical trials, are they as culturally accepted in APAC, where a lot of people want to go and see their doctor?
True.
So
there's like a whole other culture around seeing doctors, right? It's a different experience. Because I have friends who are physicians in the UK and Europe, and the way you treat going to the doctor and the way you treat doctors in general is very different. And I don't know if you found this, where it's like, hey, usually in Asia, it's like, you have so much respect, right?
Yes.
It's like, it's almost like kiss the ground they're walking on kind of respect, right?
Oh, it's 100%.
And there's just not that kind of vibe in Europe. Yeah.
No, and I mean, I personally am Indian, so that respect, it comes from like childhood, where it's the stereotype, but your parents want you to be a doctor. It comes from that, and then they're so respected, and everyone looks forward to seeing their doctor, and and in a lot of local smaller villages, if we're talking about diverse populations, that doctor is a pillar of their community. That's somebody that they would go to, somebody they know personally too.
Yeah.
So yeah, they want to go in and see them.
So it's like the healer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's another interesting conversation when it comes to including these diverse populations. Is there's a huge cultural shift that it's completely different to the US or the UK. So if we're struggling to implement in the UK, in other European countries, how is technology going to be adapted in these more diverse populations where it's even more needed to get these patients and participants to join the trials? So that's where I'm always like, okay, what's going to be done?
When you're at this basically negotiating table with these different stakeholders from all around the world, what are like the key differences you see, right? Well, you talked about how the US adopts technology faster, but other than that, in terms of personality, are there key differences when you're sitting there?
Completely different. Completely different. And I think this is something that, in business development, you have to really understand is, especially in Europe, it's not just Europe, the continent, it's Europe with 20 odd countries. And each country is so different in their culture, their personality, how they want to be sold to, how they don't want to be sold to. Like, you can't use the same language everywhere. And then APAC again is very, very different. Israel, for example, is very much based on building relationships there, personal relationships. The same with the Nordics, because everyone there knows each other. You know, there's a small village of companies there, then everyone moves from company to company. So it's word of mouth, it's building relationships. Whereas you could go to the UK and they're a lot more open to somebody they've never met before. And then Switzerland can be quite harsh. But if you get in there and if you do a good job and they trust you, then they're quite loyal. They're very loyal. So each country, I would say, has their own personality, and that's something that you have to learn and adapt as you go as to how to speak to that personality.
Are there countries that, you know, as like a non-white female, you know that you won't be able to close?
I would say that I struggle with the Middle East because traditionally over there, women have obviously been a brown woman as well. They don't have the same rights over there.
In Asia, right? In Asian culture, women are taught to be submissive, quiet, you know, like don't speak too loud, you're not a man, right? And it's like all of these little indoctrinations to say like, hey, like how can we really, put Asian women at the forefront when every day young girls in Asia are still being taught, hey, shh.
Yes, 100%. And there's still a big, in the Indian community, I just turned, I'm 25, and you turn 25 and everyone's like, so when are you going to get married? Nobody is asking me about my career. Like, it's always, when are you going to get married? When are you going to settle down? When are you going to have children? And I'm like, there's so much more to me as an Asian woman than marrying, having kids and doing that. But that's the path that sadly still a lot of Asian women feel they have to take because it's culturally still quite embedded. I feel there is a bit of a shift now. It's slowly, there's a bit more rebellion, which I love. Coming from India and seeing how the disparity between health there, between the rich and the poor, is just like something you've never seen. Healthcare doesn't exist if you don't have money.
In India?
In India. It just doesn't. And clinical trials are just not accessible. That if you don't have a doctor or someone that's going to refer you to a clinical trial, they've got no idea they exist or where to go to have access to them.
And so for the incurable diseases where patients have to take part in clinical studies, they basically just...
They don't know that a clinical trial's happening, so they don't take part in them. Some of these people may have not been to the doctor in years. They've got diagnosed when they were really sick, and then that's it. And these are huge populations, millions of people that just don't have access.